There and welcome to another webinar in our series on trustee roles and responsibilities. My name is Tracy Bird and I run the SCVO Trustee Network, which is sponsored by Rathbones. They're one of the leading charity investment managers in the UK, and their support enables us to offer these free sessions to our members. So thank you for joining us today. And as you've heard, this session will be recorded. And what I mean by that is the presentations from myself and Robin, but we will switch off the recording before we go to questions at the end. So if you do have any kind of contentious issues you'd like to discuss with us, that's the time to do it. Or you can get in touch afterwards and we can set up a one-to-one session. And just to note, we will send the slides out to you afterwards and links to further resources in a follow-up email. So we're running these webinars with our SCVO free legal advice service partners because we recognise how important it is that as a trustee, you know what to expect and what's expected of you when you join a board. And I'm delighted that we have with us today, Robin Fallis, and he's a partner at MacRoberts, who are one of the partner firms in SCVO's free legal advice service. Robin's supported SCVO members for many years, and he's also been a charity trustee himself, and he's going to take us through the key legal responsibilities of a charity trustee. Now, I did mention the SCVO free legal advice service, and for anybody that doesn't know much about it, it's open to SCVO members with an income of less than £500,000, and it gives member organisations access to up to 2 hours free legal advice, and that can be on all manner of topics ranging from governance and charity law right through to property and employment law. So again, if you've got any particular questions you want to ask that you'd rather not share in this webinar, you can contact us afterwards for either a one-to-one session with me or my colleague, Rhonda, or for legal advice from one of the partner firms. So before I hand over to Robin, I'm going to start by looking at why induction and regular training and board development is so important for trustees, to help them understand their role and responsibilities. And I'm going to talk you through some of the ways SCVO can help with resources in e-learning. But before I do that, can I just ask you to tell me whether or not you received an induction when you first became a trustee? So my colleague Chris is just going to put a poll up for you to answer. And as I say, the question is, did you get an induction when you first became a trustee, which helped you understand your role and responsibilities? In previous sessions like this, it's always been about 50-50 on this, but I'll just give you time to answer this and we'll see where we're at. Okay, we're at 14 answers and more of you did not receive an induction than did, which isn't good, is it? So hopefully today will help you with some of that. Yes, it's even going up, so 69%. Okay, thanks for taking part in that. So as I say, I'm going to go through some slides. My colleague Rhonda is going to help me with that. Just going to stop sharing that. And okay, so as I said, why is trustee training and induction important? Well, I would say as a trustee, you have to be prepared and equipped to make good collective decisions. And that's so your organisation can be as sustainable and effective as possible. So I think, and I hope, in any paid job role that you've maybe had in the past, you've had an induction, you've learned about the role and your responsibilities in your organisation. And I would say, just because trusteeship's unpaid, it really shouldn't be any different. You should get an induction. So on the next slide, I'm just going to go through, we've got lots of resources on our website for trustees, and this includes information on where you can advertise your trustee vacancies, and also what you need to think about for a trustee induction. So this includes a link to a sample induction checklist on the next slide. And you can download this and add your own specific ideas for your own organisation. So this list is difficult to see, but obviously in the slides we'll send out, you'll see it better. But it includes essentials you have to give to trustees, such as a copy of your governing document and your accounts, and your previous minutes. And as well as giving these to your new recruits, you do have to ensure they have read and understood these key documents. And your trustees also should be able to visit your organisation and meet with existing trustees and staff, volunteers and beneficiaries and service users, and also have a full understanding of what expenses they can claim as a trustee. And also think about having an existing trustee who's been on the board a while, mentor a new one, and make sure you continue to develop your board with training and support. Because a good induction will set the groundwork for the future. And also, I would say, check in with the new trustees after 6 months, just to ensure their knowledge and understanding is as it should be. So on the next slide, we've got the link there, just really to our bank of model templates and policies that you can download. Now, these include a conflict of interest policy, a scheme of delegation, and a trustee expenses policy as well. So check them out. And if there are any gaps, do let us know and we can work on new topics. And I would say, if you've got these documents, it's important to have them all agreed by the trustees and available for reference if anything should go wrong. So, for example, an effective board has to act as a team, but sometimes you do get personality clashes and some, dare I say, bad behaviour. So if you've got a robust code of conduct that you've all agreed to, which sets out expected standards, then you can use that to address any issues and start what might be potentially difficult conversations. So on the next slide, just want to draw your attention to an e-learning platform we have on our website. And that's a great induction tool and also a good refresher for trustees that have been on the board for a while. It's got 5 modules and they cover governance, finance, fundraising, communications and risk management. And what I think the beauty of this is you can complete your learning at a time and a place that suits you. So do check that out. I think that's really useful. And then next we've got the SCVO Trustee Network. And I hope you've all signed up to that. The details are on the next slide. And what that does is it provides support and guidance to members of committees and boards with a regular news bulletin and webinars like this. For example, last month we had one on charity accounting. So you can check out that one if you missed it on our YouTube channel. And then on the next slide, I just want to touch on, finally, when you're all working together, hopefully, why not check out how you measure up to the Third Sector Governance Code? SCVO have created a digital tool, our Good Governance Checkup. And this is where individual trustees can answer questions about the Third Sector Governance Code. And it has 5 principles. So that's organisational purpose, leadership, board behaviour, control and effectiveness. And what it does is it takes about 30 minutes to complete, and you get a personalised action plan and an opportunity to book some time in with us for a one-to-one support on governance. And also, by individual trustees completing this checkup, you're helping us at SCVO gather an accurate picture of the quality of governance in organisations across Scotland. So we're just beginning to build that up. And one of the, I think, interesting things we've discovered so far from trustees that have completed the checkup is that most trustees are not linked with an existing trustee as a mentor, and they generally are not asked for references before appointment either. I don't know whether that would be the same in your organisations. So on the next slide, I just want to highlight our information service, which myself and my colleague Rhonda McLean run. And, you know, I've given you a whistle-stop tour of the resources that can help you as a trustee, but please do contact the information service if you've got any specific queries on governance or anything else, really. We get lots of different kinds of questions on all manner of things. So thank you for listening to me. Now I'm going to hand over to Robin for his presentation, but do use the chat as we go to ask questions and make your own suggestions as well as we're going. And we will have time to cover these at the end. So over to you, Robin.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I assume you can all hear me fine, or someone will tell me if you cannot.
Yes, all good.
Thank you. Tracy set me up well for today. She was talking earlier and she said maybe afterwards we'll do a post-mortem. So hopefully I can keep it a little bit more lively than that may suggest. And to do so, I'd like to sort of keep it quite practical for you in terms of how the legal trustees' duties channel through into practice as a trustee, being a trustee. And for that, we'll start off going through a little bit of context. Tracy has kindly introduced me, says a little bit about what I do. I've been a trustee in various positions for just about 20 years. I've been a director on a charitable subsidiary for about 6 years. I'm on the Law Society's Charity Law subcommittee. We speak with Oscar a fair bit. So in short, I've seen boards good, boards bad, boards changing, boards wavering, and trustees' duties come up in a myriad of ways over that time and during that process. So I want to start with context, because I think context is really important to trustees' duties, how they are framed and what they do. Said that, and then the slides will move on. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so let's take a simple charity on the right-hand side. You've got the trustees who are taking the decisions, who set the strategy, who are ultimately responsible for that charity. Depending on the nature of the charity, bigger ones may have executive managers, may have staff, smaller ones may have volunteers, some may have nobody else involved. And again, on members, some charities will have a wide group of memberships in a particular local area, or with a particular health condition, or with a particular interest. Other charities will be straightforward, just the trustees, varying shapes and sizes. It's fair to say that the principles of trustees' duties come from fairly simple principles that are shared with myriad other structures, businesses, company law, we'll touch on that in a little bit, or just organizational common sense. But what's important is they're turned into legal duties in the regulatory context of charities. And the reason for that, put simply, is because charities exist to deliver public benefit, and charities are afforded charitable tax relief, special charitable tax relief. So the trustees' duties are designed to give the regulator the ability to police how they're operating. And that's an ability over and above, say, what the Companies Act does for companies. Just by comparison, and if we use sort of the banking crisis as an example, for those companies that sort of went wrong, the big banks, the duties of the directors are owed to the company. They're not owed more widely. But in the charity context, the duties of trustees are actively regulated by Oscar. And again, if you go to the left-hand side of the slide, the reason for that is because they're there for public benefit, a number of stakeholders, contracted parties. That can be the same in other areas of business. But importantly, in the charitable sphere, you've also got donations, people giving their money towards an activity, expecting that to be treated in a particular way, expecting it to be safe. And I think, again, in context terms, it's interesting to think of it that when Oscar receives an application for a new charity, it looks at its constitution, it looks at what it's going to do, it does all these checks, and it says, yes, we're going to give you that special status. But beyond that, trustees' duties are an important tool for Oscar to be able to dip in and say, hold on, something's not going right here. They're an important safety net for the charity sector. And it's important to bear that in mind, that context in mind as we go through. If you fall asleep, go for a cup of tea, whatever it is. I think the real things that I would like to emphasize, which they're sort of irrespective of trustees' duties, but very closely connected, is that trustee, your role is to do the best you possibly can for the charity and the charity alone. And that's the bottom line for a charity trustee. And the way I think of it is that more than a company director, more than somebody who has an interest in something, as a charity trustee, you're really viewed as a custodian of the public benefit that the charity is there to deliver, whether that's to push forward an area of health, whether that's to push forward local amenities for children or whatever it is. And it flows from that it's really quite a high duty of care, or a higher duty of care, and we'll see that as we go through, than in other spheres. that the legal trustees' duties place upon you. The bottom one is possibly the key point that's most important at a practical level, and it's probably the one that leads to the most issues that Oscar sees or that charities come across. And that's that amongst a group of trustees, ultimately, you're to come up with collective decisions to take forward things for the charity in the best way to protect them, to be custodians. And you have to be able to sort of show the processes. You have to document them so that you can show that you've reached a decision in a particular way. You've reached a decision in a way that sort of matches that sort of high regulated level of care that's expected. And that can be difficult, and it can be subject to scrutiny. Sometimes there can be differing views along the way, but really sort of getting that all documented in terms of your processes, and Tracy's touched on some of that, and then in terms of actually noting reasons for things is really quite important. I'll put a small caveat on that, which is horses for courses. I said I've acted with tiny charities to massive ones, and the sort of level of documentation, decision-making process naturally needs to vary between these organisations according to their size. A couple more just sort of general points before we get into trustees' duties themselves. I mean, just marrying up trustees to general principles of governance, which are leadership, direction, and control of an organisation. Again, governance generally is a process of collective decision-making and implementation, and that you'll have seen emphasised in the last slide, and you'll see it emphasised in Oscar publications on the same. And characteristics of good governance, again, this is generally speaking not specific to charities: transparency, accountability, inclusion and participation, effectiveness and efficiency, and compliance with laws and regulation. I would say that in the charity sphere, the middle one of these sort of is less to the fore in terms of what the duties are focused on, but very much the duties are focused on that accountability and that transparency and being able to show what's been done. And I'll touch on a couple of the other points as we go through with different examples. And again, just this is almost like the pyramid from left to right. The legal duties come in on the charity trustees, or if you're a charitable company, the trustees who are also the directors, and it rests with them individually and collectively. So if you do have staff, you don't sort of pass down the legal duties; they remain with the directors or the trustees. And in that instance, you have to be able to show the processes going down the way, good processes or a good safety net is how I'll come on and describe it in a little bit. So it's that flow of, depending on the type of the charity, you have the duties at the top on the trustees and they flow down through the organisation. So with that context out of the way, if you like, I'd just like to recap on trustees' duties for some of you, or introduce them for the first time for others. I'm deliberately not going overboard on the legal references. For those that want it, the trustees' duties are in Section 66 of the Charities and Trustees Investment Scotland Act 2005. And again, I've just emphasised that point. That act sets out the framework for Oscar being able to put charities onto the register, and then through its toolkit, being able to make sure that they are still delivering that public benefit and delivering it appropriately. And in that context, those Section 66 trustees' duties come into play and play their role. So very briefly on what those duties are, and we'll go through each of them in just a second. We have, importantly, up at the top, to act in the interests of the charity. And on the left-hand side, to ensure that the charity acts in a manner which is consistent with its purposes, or consistent with its charitable objects, what's set out in its constitution. And that extends to making sure that the trustees make sure that they follow their constitution. In the middle, to act with the care and diligence that it's reasonable to expect of a person who's managing the affairs of another. I mentioned at the outset that it's a higher degree of care, and that is a higher degree of care than is in place, for example, companies where it's reasonable care and diligence. Here it's one that brings in that, again, that custodian idea that I set out earlier, managing the affairs of another, and again, come into detail on that. The actual way in which the Act is phrased, managing conflict of interest, has certainly been a bit narrower in that it's focused on conflicts between organisations responsible for appointing a trustee and the charity. But Oscar's been very clear in its guidance that actually acting in the interests of the charity requires a management conflicts process really across the board of trustees. And down at the bottom, again, think of it as this toolkit. It's a duty of the trustee to ensure that they comply with directions, requirements, notices, and that might be submission of returns, submission of accounts, or it may be simply Oscar getting in touch with the charity in another way, asking for information or otherwise. So that's the duties altogether. And if we just unpick them a little bit and go through each of them. So what is it we mean by acting in the interests of the charity? It's perhaps easiest to put an explanation on that, which is what's on the slide, put the charity's interest before any other. It's possibly more useful to talk about what fails or what starts to chip away at that trustee duty. Where does it get into a more difficult position? And I suppose that's where very obviously a trustee has an interest in a business which is interfacing with the charity, and perhaps the trustees or that individual trustee or the trustees as a whole don't take a decision that's squarely in the interest of the charity. They get deflected into another area. Similarly, people that might be connected with trustees, a partner of a trustee or whatever else, they might have an interest in another business. And if you get into these more complicated scenarios, you can see where it can be called into question that the trustees are acting in the interests of the charity. You get all sorts of, I'd call it, emotional, lesser, more complicated, difficult things, where you might have schisms between boards and individuals don't get on with someone, so they start acting in that way and sort of lose the thread of, hold on, I should be acting in the interest of the charity here and not just in sort of promoting my own agenda. Just to add a little bit more to that, some of the Oscar inquiries into charities, which are available on its website and which are quite useful to sort of take a look at from time to time, are useful. So this year, 2023, they took a good look at Social Bite and a connected charity to that, the World's Big Sleep Out. Now, they were very high-profile charities. And I think the short thing is that Oscar took a very good look at whether the trustees had acted in the interests of each charity, because there was a bit of confusion. Some people were involved in both of the organisations, so there's a question mark of whether through their actions they were squarely acting in the interests of the charity, or whether because of their relationship with the other organisation, their role in the other organisation, they were failing in that duty. And Oscar took a good look at that and it came up with some recommendations as a result of that. But that maybe gives another example of what do we mean. Another one, which is a bit of a nuance, but it sort of came into my head, is what was called the Glasgow East Regeneration Agency inquiry, and that's maybe 5 or so years old. But in that one, the trustees had a contractual, an employee was due a contractual payment for ceasing to be employed, and the charity paid well over that. And Oscar, in its sort of inquiry, took to hold them over the coals and said, hold on, you're to be acting in the interest of the charity. We appreciate you might sort of like this person, know this person, want to give them a good send-off, but in your actions, you have to show that you're acting in the interest. So you have to be able to justify why you're going over and above a contractual payment and paying out more money. So that's just another example of where that can come into play. Okay, if we can move to the next of the duties, it's what do we mean by ensuring the charity acts in a manner which is consistent with its purposes? And again, the sort of simple positives are acting in accordance with the Constitution, ensuring assets are only used for those purposes, and as Tracy touched on in her introduction and some of the things that you would want to do in an induction, Oscar points to making sure that trustees are familiar with the Constitution. Now, quite often where we see this arise in practice, and I think it's always useful to give examples of where this duty is not being met. Again, Oscar inquiry reports this year, 2023, for Freewheel North and Zest Football Club. They were both examples where, for one reason or another, the charity was not following its constitution. I think the Freewheel North was to do with appointment of new members. I think Zest Football Club was to do with not operating with the right number of charity trustees. But again, the flow of those is, and linking it back to what I said at the outset, Oscar gives charitable status, and then its duties are there to sort of act as a tool to make sure that carries on being the case. And if they've said that the charity is going to operate with 3 trustees, it needs to operate with 3 trustees. If it says that members are to be appointed in a particular way, they need to be appointed in that way. I suppose the other example where this comes into play a lot historically is if a charity oversteps its objects. It's maybe a children's charity and it starts dealing with adults in a way that there's really an inconsistency there. And again, if you remember the context, this is all to do with the public understanding what a charity is there for. So ensuring that it's acting in a way consistent with its purposes is trying to give that clarity, that transparency for the public, and ensure that that's held in place. So again, I'm sure in discussion there might be some other examples, but it's just to give a little bit more of the detail on what we mean by that and what sits contrary to it. So the next one, what do we mean by acting with care and diligence? As I've already said, it's a higher standard of care than is out there. And it's really, these are from the Oscar website, from the Oscar guidance. The duty on the trustees, different ways of saying it, is to ensure that they meet with legal requirements, ensure the charity has sufficient funds, ensure that it's protecting its assets, ensure that the governing body, the trustees, meet the requirements for that charity. You know, if there's no marketing person and you're really dependent on big fundraising and successful fundraising, that is it fit for purpose? Exercising reasonable business sense is another one for acting with care and diligence. We always get in trouble as lawyers for noting take advice when required. We get called ambulance chases and all the rest. But there are instances when taking advice is absolutely needed and appropriate, particularly transfers of property or entering into contracts. And down at the bottom, exercising effective control over staff and contractors. And again, sort of staying away from postmortems and trying to bring that to life a little bit. Various examples of Oscar inquiries. I've seen myself an Oscar inquiry into a charity about exercising effective control over staff and contractors, where there was a complaint that the trustees were not holding their chief executive to account. They were giving that chief executive too much space to do what they wanted, and really the law, the level of care and diligence expected was that they should be more proactive and have better processes in place for that. Other examples, and I'm going to go back a little bit in time, but it's such a pertinent one, it's worth mentioning. One of the early Oscar inquiries was into the OnePlus charity that ultimately folded for lack of funds. And in that, they really focused in on the point around ensuring a charity has sufficient funds and the steps, the processes that trustees should be taking in order to do that. You know, making sure they had up-to-date information, making sure that the financial position was looked at sufficient intervals in a year, making sure, as appropriate, that there's a finance subcommittee, making sure the trustees have understanding of that. And again, that was an example where Oscar called into question whether the appropriate trustee duty on care and diligence had been met and gave recommendations to the sector on things that should be done. And again, another example, it's a little while back, was an inquiry into the Sick Kids Hospital, Sick Kids Pyjamas Fund, where I think a fundraising initiative was run that led to a significant loss. I think it was into the hundreds of thousands. It simply didn't deliver on what was anticipated. And an important point to draw out of that was Oscar, in looking at care and diligence, weren't sort of looking at the fundamentals of the reasons why the campaign didn't succeed. What they wanted to see was that the trustees had applied appropriate scrutiny, and they wanted to see the recording of that, see the minutes, see what steps they'd taken, see, sort of understand that the trustees had exercised that care in approaching that particular initiative. And it's worth bearing in mind, Oscar's not there to slap charities on the wrists if something doesn't work out. They're there to check that the processes in place were appropriate, linking back to that regulatory oversight of what they do. This is the one, and I think I've used the word before, horses for courses. If you're a tiny village charity operating a duck race, then it's crazy to expect that you have audit committees and all sorts of committees and huge amounts of paper and everything dotted and crossed and all the rest of it. There's an element of proportionality, appropriateness in there, which I'll be honest, can sometimes be difficult to get the right level of. Okay, we touched on declaring and managing conflicts slightly earlier. We talked about it a little bit in acting in the interests of the charity, and I mentioned the example of the big sleep out and Oscar looking into that, and Social Bite, and whether the people involved had been acting in an appropriate way and avoiding conflicts. And again, it links back to my earlier slide of that first point of, act in the interests of the charity alone, and we have it there, put the interests of the charity above those of another person. And then really it's process. Oscar wants to see the process. Have in place a declaration of conflicts of interest, have a standing agenda item, any conflicts in the business to be discussed today, that register of trustees' duties, and then the minutes. What they do is they give you a framework to say, well, look, we have declared them and we have managed our conflicts, we've been aware of them. And really, what that gives you is that protection that you've met your duties, as against the alternative scenario of no register, no agenda item, no record. And then if it turns out, if, I don't know, trustee John's sister entered into a contract for £10,000 with the charity isn't able to turn back and say, look, here's our records of how we managed it. So it's, again, that process point of having in place those things. I'll pause there. That's the trustees' duties in a nutshell, hopefully with some practicalities I put around them. I said at the very outset that trustees' duties are not a million miles away from duties that you get with other organisations. So largely for comparative purposes, but also of relevance to those of you who are trustees and also company directors. Here are the directors' duties under the Companies Act, and you'll see very close similarity in the first two, the first three. You'll see the level of care there. It's not couched in the same way. It's not so high. And you'll see that really the interests, including benefits from third parties, come into play down the bottom. We'll say the Companies Act is more detailed, but you get the gist that they follow the same themes. For what it's worth, it's interesting to note that the legal duties in a company expand a little bit on what promoting the success of the company is. And there's an analogy between that and acting in the interests of a charity. But it doesn't tie these down hard and fast, because as you'll see on the left, it's have regard to, and the sorts of things that come into play there are the sorts of things on the slide, and the likely consequences, interests of employees, relationships with wider stakeholders, impacts and such like. Again, I would sort of reflect back to our earlier slide when we had the wider context of the charity as an organisation on the right-hand side, and the different stakeholders or contractors on the left-hand side. And again, there's not much different in what's going on there. Charity law doesn't go into these sorts of specifics, but it's useful to have them in mind. Okay, I would like to sort of broaden this out a little bit, because so far we've focused on the specific 2005 Act trustee duties, which are on the left-hand side: best interest, follow constitution, the care and diligence for a third party, acting in accordance with law, and doing your regulatory filings. Then in the middle, we've just touched on them, the company law equivalents, just either for comparison or for interest. And on the right-hand side, it's worth noting that trustees will also have common law duties on them and other sectoral statutory duties. So delictual liability, fiduciary duties, duties of care. These are general common law ones. For example, delictual, if you're negligent as a trustee, then other potential liabilities can come into play. Down at the bottom, you have the likes of the health and safety executive, who will place statutory responsibilities on directors in companies, trustees in the charity context, to ensure health and safety. What I would say, and why it's up the top, is that a lot of these combined duties can be dealt with by documenting decisions. Your documenting decisions can cover off the best interests. We're doing this because of X, Y, Z. ABC don't agree for ABC reasons. D, E, F, G think this is good for this reason. Collectively, we've decided this, and you've got a documenting of that. Follow the Constitution, again, document it. The ones that are trickier tend to be around the level of care. I mentioned taking appropriate advice earlier as one of the things that come into play for care. And again, this is why people will draw in the legal advice, the financial advice, the particular expertise advice on safeguarding or whatever else, just to give them robustness that the correct level of care has been met on a particularly difficult or high profile or risky decision. So yeah, it's worth sort of mentioning that a lot of these things you can tick off, it would be the blunt way of putting it, by scheduling them in, going through process, and the remainder you can, the level of care ones, quite often it's by getting that further reassurance that the appropriate steps are being taken. Brief mention on who polices trustees, and no surprise from where I started with. We have Oscar, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, using its own tools, the trustees' duties, to make sure that it's maintaining that public benefit of all charities. Don't lose sight of HMRC. HMRC is also policing the tax compliance of what charity trustees are doing. Then the sectoral regulators such as Health and Safety Executive and others. And it's worth noting the three at the bottom, and I perhaps should include staff here. Members, staff, donors and funders, stakeholders, and the general public. A lot of inquiries or inquiry reports that come out of Oscar, the genesis of them, I think, is often a complaint from a disgruntled member, or rightly or wrongly, or staff, or somebody that's given a donation and things have gone in a different direction to what they wanted, and indeed a member of the public. So it's quite interesting that the sort of genesis of a lot of the complaints that lead to investigation of Oscar's duties are quite often from people quite close to a charity, in my experience anyway. So there's an overlap here a little bit with some of the points that Tracy opened up with, but if you like, for me, these are the key documents to ensuring that a charity covers off these various duties. So I'll leave trustee induction. I'll start with the risk register, because I think sometimes I've described this as the beating heart of a charity's compliance. Because if you think about that idea of being a custodian, making sure the assets are okay, acting in the best interest, acting with care and diligence, if you've got a risk register that's covering the different aspects of what you do and the steps that you're taking to make sure that everything's okay in relation to those, then that's a really good start point. It's a really good start point in terms of demonstrating back to Oscar as the regulator that you've taken the appropriate steps. And again, horses for courses. Sometimes that risk register is quite small. Sometimes it runs to there's hundreds of pages, and sometimes it's delegated to a risk manager in the largest of charities. Linked to what I said about 1+, consideration of up-to-date information. making sure that the information the trustees are getting from whatever source, either themselves from the bank, through a finance manager, through a volunteer finance manager, is up-to-date information. There's not a lag, because bear in mind that here and the 1+ is that you really need to know what you're doing. It's like you're managing someone else's affairs. No point having information that's 3 months out of date and then the charity goes under. The next one, cannot emphasize enough on the left-hand side, the next row, clear decision-making processes and documentation. If you've got the documentation to show to Oscar why the charity took a particular decision, why it sold a house, why it decided to shut down a service, why it did a number of things that any number of people might take issue with, then you're in a good place. So clear minutes where it's advice, sort of showing that you've had that advice. Linked to that, clear operational processes and implementation. I suppose they're more important for the trustees and staff, or trustees, staff and members, to show that where things have been done that aren't by the trustees but that are done by others, that there's a sort of safety net, a network of documentation on what's been done. Register of interests we've covered, and register of trustees and register of members is well, it's a legal requirement for the companies, charitable companies, and it's a legal requirement for SCVOs, and it's just a matter of good practice in terms of knowing who your members are and trustees are. I think I mentioned a couple of examples in where they weren't acting in accordance with their constitution, and part of the reason was they were a bit fuzzy around where they were. And the not ambulance chasing, taking of advice where appropriate remains important as well, particularly if it's an area that the trustees are unfamiliar with or that carries a particular risk or weight for the charity. So I've fused, as I've gone through, this idea of safety nets. I talked about the duties themselves being Oscar's safety net, but for trustees, I like to think of that previous slide of all the different things. It's that gives you, or the charities that you're dealing with who have trustees, the legal safety net that they are meeting their duties. If they can show that they've taken the interest in the actions in the interest, they can show they've considered their constitution, they can show that they've put in place appropriate processes to deal with the different things, then if they've done all that, they can show it to Oscar if Oscar comes and asks them to demonstrate that they've met their trustees' duties. So I think it's useful to think of it in that context. There are the high-level duties, and then there's the process that Oscar focuses on. So if you have that set out, then that's what gives you, as trustees, this legal safety net that you're meeting your duties. So just to finish, because I see these as possibly the more connected things, or things that are worthy of brief mention in this particular session. Trustees may be remunerated in Scotland. It's quite often an area that's misunderstood. Some charity constitutions don't permit it. You need to check the constitution. But if the constitution permits it, then the requirements are in section 67 and 68 of the Charities and Trustee Investment Scotland Act, that the maximum remuneration needs to be set out in writing, and the charity has to ensure that less than 50% of its trustees are in receipt of that remuneration. And the trustees also just need to record that the entering into the arrangement is considered by the trustees as a whole, excluding the conflicted particular trustee who is being remunerated, that is in the interest of the charity. So again, that's a documentation, a process thing. But just to emphasize that if you're a sort of charity that's interested in remuneration, it is permitted. You can do it. And finally, I'm going to go back to my Oscar safety net. And I said that trustee duties were one tool. They have other tools. They can make investigations, they can take actions, they can give directions to charities. And another way in which they sort of keep an eye on things is charities should be notifying them of a serious incidents. For example, the sorts of things that we tend to advise our clients to notify them of are particularly if there's an issue with finance, if they're on a sugary peg, but also if there's a really bad press story just about to come out, something that's really going to damage the reputation, Oscar has a piece of guidance on this, and it's worth being aware of that and remembering that, because again, it's part of the interest of the charity acting with appropriate care. It fits into that they should be letting Oscar know if there's a big problem round the corner, generally. A brief word on recent Oscar activity relevant to trustees' duties. I sort of left that hanging there. I think I've gone through probably most of the ones that are of interest as we've gone along. So I won't add to that at the moment. Again, just a reminder that they are on the Oscar website, the inquiry reports. They are useful because invariably they include recommendations at the end of them that are sort of more for general digestion. So again, we touched the big sleep out, we touched on social bite, we touched on I think Pollock was another ones where they hadn't followed properly their constitutions. And briefly and finally, it's not really the subject of today, but this year we've had our 2005 Act amended and updated by the Charities Regulation and Administration Scotland Act 2023. So by way of brief comment on that, and I'm going to stick with my toolkit analogy, it has complemented Oscar's toolkit, given them more tools around transparency, intervention where things are going wrong. So for example, they will in time now introduce a register of trustees in Scotland. They have made amendments to be able to make their sharing of accounts more robust. They've given themselves the ability to intervene more in failing charities. And that's really what this act has done. It's a tidy up act for the Oscar toolkit. And for the purposes of today, I just wanted to mention that and not go into too much more detail on it because it's not absolutely on topic for trustees' duties. But hopefully all of that has made sense to all of you. And on that note, I will stop my share and I think we'll see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Robin. That was